Your generous support makes this ministry possible. Thank you.
Now, we're looking at the amillennial position and evaluating it, and we have come to Revelation chapter 20. And we are on page 13 of our outline. One of the weaknesses of the amillennial position is the weakness of their interpretation of Revelation 20. Amillennialists have a tough time in Revelation 20. There are two specific problems in verses 1 to 3. There is a problem, a real problem with their interpretation of the binding of Satan. In Revelation 20, we have the binding of Satan. But in the book of Revelation, it is immediately following the second coming of Christ. So the binding of Satan in the context is immediately following the coming of Christ. I'm going to show in a minute why you cannot take that binding of Satan at a different time than following the second coming of Christ. Secondly, the binding of Satan takes place in an eschatological setting where the resurrection of the dead takes place. We have in the rest of chapter 20 the resurrection of the dead. The binding of Satan takes place in a context where it refers to he is bound with a chain, he is thrown into a bottomless pit, it is sealed, there's a key. All of these speak of an absolute binding. How does the amillennialist say that Satan is bound? What's his answer? He's got a long chain, but how is he bound? Spiritually? Yeah, he is only bound in a limited sense. He is only bound in the sense that he is not able to deceive the nations in such a way as to keep them from coming to a knowledge of the truth or to get saved. Now, point D here is that when you look at what the New Testament says about Satan today, he is so active, it is really difficult to say that Satan is bound today. 1 Peter 5:8. What does it say? Your adversary, the devil, walks about as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Does that sound like Satan is bound? Ephesians chapter 6 and verses 10 to 12. Paul says, finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the full armor of God that you may be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. You look at that passage, and Satan doesn't seem to be bound. He is very active and powerful.
Could people say that it's just other demons, not Satan?
Well, could it be that people will say that's just other demons and not Satan? But verse 7 says that you may be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. So, now, you might try to find some wiggle room in those verses, but look at 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 3. 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 3. This is a very important passage, not just for your eschatology, but for your whole view of man and his ability to respond to the gospel. What 2 Corinthians 4 says is that any human response to the gospel has to be the result of not man's own ability, but the enabling work of the Holy Spirit. But 2 Corinthians 4 says in verse 3, "But even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing, in whose case the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelieving, that they might not see the light of the gospel of the glory of God, of Christ, who is the image of God." Is Satan able to deceive the nations today? Is he? What does this verse say? He says he has blinded men. Why? So that they might not see the light of the gospel. Now, how can you say in the light of this verse that Satan is really bound in this age, even in this limited sense that the amillennialist wants to make it? The binding of Satan is something that is going to take place in the future when he really will be bound and will not deceive the nations, because he will not be active here on the earth during the millennial reign of Christ. So, look at the binding of Satan in Revelation 20 in verses 1 to 3. Is the amillennialist giving us really a satisfactory explanation of this passage? I do not think so. Now, secondly, the second thing that we have in Revelation 20 is verses 4 to 6. And here we have the two resurrections. We have the resurrection, the first resurrection, 1,000 years, and then the resurrection of the rest of the dead. Now, the first thing that we noted is that the amillennialist cannot take the book of Revelation here in any kind of chronological sense where chapter 20 follows chapter 19. Why can't he? What's in chapter 19? The return of Christ is in chapter 19. What do we have in chapter 20? We have the resurrection of the dead, the 1,000 years, and then the resurrection of believing dead, the 1,000 years, and then the resurrection of the rest of the dead. They cannot take this as something that takes place following the second coming of Christ. And so how do they take Revelation 20? We said that usually they follow what is called the recapitulation view of the book of Revelation, where you go back to the beginning of the church age in chapter 20. Now, that is not very convincing, and I want to show you why. Look at chapter 13 of Revelation. Look at Revelation chapter 13. Revelation 13 gives us a picture or a description of the unholy Trinity. The unholy Trinity, the satanic Trinity. Notice who we have here described in these verses. First of all, verse 4, and says they worshipped the dragon. Who is the dragon? He is defined here in the passage as Satan. They worshipped the dragon because he gave his authority to the beast. Who is the beast? The beast is the Antichrist. And they worship the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast, and who is able to wage war with him?" So you have Satan, you have the Antichrist, and you'll notice in verse 11, we have another beast. "And I saw another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb, and he spoke as a dragon. And he exercises all of the authority of the first beast in his presence, and he makes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast, whose fatal wound was healed." Here you have the false prophet. You have these three. You have the dragon, Satan, you have the first beast, who is the Antichrist, and you have the second beast, who is the false prophet. This is the unholy trinity. Now, go to chapter 19. In chapter 19, we have a description of the second coming of Christ. What takes place in chapter 19 at the second coming of Christ? Notice verse 19. "And I saw the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies assembled to make war against him who sat on the horse and against his army." This is the Antichrist in his opposition to Christ, making war against him. "And the beast was seized, and with him the false prophet, who performed the signs in his presence, by which he deceived those who had received the mark of the beast and those who worshipped the image. And these two, the beast and the false prophet, the Antichrist and the false prophet, were thrown alive into the lake of fire, which burns with brimstone." You notice here that at the second coming of Christ, we have the judgment of the Antichrist and his false prophet. What about the judgment of the third person there of that unholy trinity? Where does that take place? Well, remember, there were no chapter divisions in the books of the Bible as they were originally written. Where is the judgment of the third person that we have in chapter 13? 2 verses later. 2 verses later in chapter 20. Do you see what we have here? We have the second coming of Christ, and we have the judgment of the Antichrist, the judgment of the false prophet, and the judgment of Satan. It all fits together. And it is very unplausible to say that chapter 20 should be separated and not refer to what is taking place at the second coming of Christ, but goes back to the beginning of the church age. Furthermore, second argument against that recapitulation view, notice verse 4 of Revelation 20, "And I saw thrones, and they sat upon them." Who's the they? Who's the they? If you look in the context, you won't find any antecedent to the word they, that pronoun, in verses 1 to 3. You have to go back to chapter 19. And in verses 5 to 10, you have the marriage supper of the Lamb. In verse 14, you have the armies in heaven. You have Christ in his army. You have none described who would sit on these thrones if you do not go back to chapter 19. So the first problem of the amillennialist is the problem of not recognizing that chapter 20 follows chapter 19 in a chronological fashion. Now, what's the second problem? The second problem is this phrase that we have in verse 4, at the end of verse 4, and they came to life. They came to life. They came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. What does that phrase mean? The amillennialist is going to interpret it spiritually. But this is a word that is found elsewhere in the book of Revelation as referring to a literal, physical resurrection. If you look at chapter 2 and verse 8, in chapter 2 and verse 8, it is used of the bodily resurrection of Christ. This says the first and the last, who was dead and he came to life. He came to life. That's used of the physical resurrection of Christ. It's used in chapter 13 and verse 14 of the beast who has the wound of the sword and he has come to life. So it's used elsewhere in Revelation. Then notice in verse 5, the rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were completed. This is the first resurrection. Now you notice that it refers at the end of the 1,000 years, the rest of the dead coming to life. Now, that is a reference to a physical resurrection. Now, there's certain amillennialists, remember I mentioned the word until last class, and Hokema says that this verse does not imply that the rest of the dead ever did come to life. What do we have in the book of, in chapter 20? What do we have in the following verses? What happens at the time of the great white throne judgment that is described here? All of the dead who are in the grave, the rest of the dead, are raised. You have, in the context of Revelation 20,